The summer of 1943 saw the first major waves of German prisoners of war arriving on American soil. Many of these men were veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, hardened by years of desert fighting. Shackled not by chains but by the bitter sting of defeat, they boarded transports in North Africa expecting the worst. Rumors swirled among them. America, they had been told, was a nation of soft men, politically divided, incapable of sustaining a long war. Nazi propaganda had painted the United States as a place of jazz clubs and corruption, a decadent society that would collapse when tested. Yet as the troop ships docked in Norfolk, Boston, and New York, the first glimpses of American harbors began unraveling that illusion. Towering cranes swung massive cargo, hundreds of workers moved with precision, and endless convoys of trucks rolled along piers. For men raised in a war-strangled Germany, this was already unsettling. Their journey inland revealed even more. Prisoners transported by guarded trains peered through windows expecting devastation from war. Instead, they saw bustling towns, farms stretching further than their eyes could reach, and factories roaring with energy. To soldiers who had left behind blackouts, rationing, and constant air raids, America appeared untouched by war, glowing with abundance. At night, city streets were brightly lit, neon signs flickered, and automobiles clogged highways even under wartime restrictions. A stunned silence often gripped the POW railcars. Some muttered in disbelief. How could this be, when Germany fought desperately just to feed its people? Upon arrival in camps, scattered across Texas, Iowa, and Georgia, they confronted another revelation. The camps themselves were orderly, clean, and governed by rules drawn from the Geneva Convention. Rations provided meat, bread, milk, and fruit. Luxuries German civilians could scarcely imagine in 1943. Even cigarettes, considered scarce gold back home, were distributed. The guards were strict, yet they were not cruel. For many German soldiers, indoctrinated to expect brutality at enemy hands, this unexpected treatment was the first crack in the ideological armor they had carried from the Reich. Still, the most profound shock was yet to come. Within weeks, prisoners would learn that what they had glimpsed from train windows was only a fraction of America's industrial might, a power so vast that it threatened to rewrite their understanding of the war itself. When the German POWs settled into their new reality, guarded camps became windows into a nation that operated on a scale they could hardly comprehend. Morning work details took them to surrounding farms, sawmills, and sometimes even nearby factories under contract. What they witnessed left them speechless. In Germany, farms were small plots often worked by hand or with limited machinery. In contrast, American farms stretched for miles, cultivated by tractors larger than the trucks many of the prisoners had driven in Europe. Grain silos rose like towers, and mechanical harvesters moved through fields with an efficiency they had never imagined. One prisoner later wrote in his diary that a single American farm family managed more land than an entire German village. It wasn't just the agriculture that astonished them. The factories they glimpsed from a distance seemed to defy logic. Smokestacks belched without pause, shift whistles sounded day and night, and train cars lined up to haul away mountains of finished goods. Rumors spread quickly inside the camps. A B-24 Liberator bomber rolling off assembly lines every 63 minutes in Michigan tanks, and trucks pouring from Detroit, faster than the Wehrmacht could replace its losses, and Liberty ships being launched in weeks rather than years. At first, these stories were dismissed as exaggeration or Allied propaganda. But when POWs saw the steady stream of aircraft flying overhead and convoys rolling past highways near their camps, the evidence was undeniable. The cultural environment amplified the shock. Even in wartime, American civilians enjoyed goods far beyond German imagination: new shoes, canned fruit, chocolate, and radios blaring swing music. Letters from German families described hunger, shortages, and endless bomb raids. Yet here, the enemy population not only had enough to eat but seemed untouched by hardship. Prisoners began to compare their homeland AS ration books with the abundant meals served in American mess halls. The Reich had insisted that Anglo-American societies were decadent and crumbling, But every day these men awoke to a society that contradicted that narrative. The psychological effect was profound. Some clung stubbornly to old beliefs, insisting America's abundance was temporary or artificial. Others quietly admitted that what they saw was real, an industrial giant whose power dwarfed Germany's best efforts. For men who had once imagined themselves defenders of a superior civilization, the contrast gnawed at their certainty. And as weeks turned into months, the shock of America's capacity began to reshape their very understanding of why the war's outcome seemed inevitable. German prisoners soon realized that the prison camps themselves were not designed merely to confine them, but to expose them, day after day, to the rhythm of American life. Scattered across more than 500 locations in 46 states, these camps were often placed near farms, lumber mills, and industrial sites where POW labor could ease the wartime manpower shortage. But unlike the forced labor and starvation conditions they had witnessed or even imposed across occupied Europe, the work here was structured, compensated, and often voluntary. Prisoners earned small wages in camp-issued scrip, which they could use at canteens to buy candy, cigarettes, or toiletries. For men accustomed to scarcity, this was bewildering. The barracks themselves were simple but humane. Wooden bunks, stoves for winter, medical care provided by U.S. Army doctors, all starkly different from what they had been told to expect. Meals shocked them most: fresh bread, meat several times a week, and vegetables in generous portions. While their families back in Germany stood in ration lines for hours, POWs in America sometimes complained of being fed too much. One captured soldier wrote in his diary that the rations given to him in Texas would have fed his entire family back in Hamburg. Interaction with American guards revealed another unexpected reality. Many guards were farmers, students, or workers drafted into service, men who treated their prisoners less with hatred than with matter-of-fact duty. Brutality was rare and punished when discovered. Instead of indoctrination lectures or propaganda sessions, the Americans relied on something far subtler: exposure to ordinary life. POWs watched their guards receive newspapers filled with open political debate, something impossible in Germany. They heard music blaring from radios, not censored speeches but popular entertainment. They even saw African-American soldiers serving in the same army that defeated them, an unsettling contrast to the rigid racial ideology they had been raised under. Yet the camps were not without tension. Some die-hard Nazis tried to maintain control, forming secret cells, intimidating fellow prisoners, and staging escape attempts. But even here, American abundance undermined discipline. With cigarettes in their pockets, food in their stomachs, and safety from bombs overhead, most prisoners had little desire to risk everything for a hopeless escape. By late 1944, escape attempts averaged less than 1 per 1,000, a testimony not to stronger fences, but to the disarming power of plenty. Occasionally, German POWs were transported through American towns en route to work sites, and those fleeting glimpses left lasting impressions. They had expected wartime austerity, shortages, and dimmed cities under blackout conditions. Instead, they saw neon lights flickering above diners, traffic jams of civilian automobiles, and shop windows filled with goods. Grocery stores displayed fruit stacked high, even bananas and oranges, exotic luxuries unavailable in Germany since before the war. To men raised under rationing and hunger, the sheer visibility of abundance was bewildering. What struck them most was that these comforts existed during wartime. Germany's cities lay in ruins from Allied bombing, rubble where neighborhoods once stood. At night, blackout curtains covered every window, and candles replaced electric bulbs. Yet here in America, skylines glowed with electricity. Even small towns had movie theaters advertising new films weekly. Many prisoners whispered that America looked more prosperous during war than Germany had during peace. The transportation network also left them in awe. Long trains hauling hundreds of freight cars rolled endlessly across the countryside. Trucks filled highways, carrying food, coal, and manufactured goods. POWs knew that Germany struggled to keep railways intact under bombing campaigns, while here the infrastructure seemed inexhaustible. One prisoner later admitted that watching just one American rail yard filled with locomotives convinced him that the Reich could never win the war. Perhaps the greatest shock came when they realized that ordinary Americans lived better than many German elites. They saw guards with wristwatches, heard about soldiers receiving paychecks large enough to buy radios or even cars, and observed workers finishing shifts only to go home to comfortable houses with refrigerators and telephones. The myth of a decadent, collapsing America crumbled before their eyes. The psychological impact deepened in letters exchanged with families back home. German civilians wrote of meager rations, of nights spent in shelters, of clothes patched again and again. Meanwhile, prisoners wrote back describing plentiful food and humane treatment. At first, they were careful with their words, fearing censorship. But as the months passed, confidence grew. Many quietly acknowledged that they were living better in captivity than their loved ones in Germany, a realization that shook their belief in Nazi propaganda more effectively than any Allied leaflet could. For many German prisoners, the true awakening came when they witnessed America's war production firsthand. Some were assigned to labor details near industrial centers where they could not ignore the scale of operations. Towering factories stretched further than their eyes could see, entire complexes devoted to producing aircraft engines, armored vehicles, or ammunition. Conveyor belts hummed day and night, while endless streams of trucks hauled finished products to rail depots. In Germany, a single bomber could take months to assemble. Here, production lines pushed out an aircraft in hours. The stories that filtered through the camps seemed unbelievable at first. Could Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan truly be rolling a B-24 bomber off the line every 63 minutes? Could Kaiser shipyards really launch Liberty ships faster than German engineers could draft blueprints? Skeptics among the POWs dismissed such claims as exaggerations. But the sheer number of planes streaking overhead, often in tight formations, made denial impossible. They had once thought Allied pilots were rotated quickly because of high losses. In truth, the Americans had so many aircraft that fresh squadrons constantly replaced one another in the skies. The contrast to Germany's struggling industry was stark. At home, Allied bombing had crippled production, oil shortages starved armored divisions, and skilled labor was exhausted. The Reich could barely sustain its forces, while America's factories flooded Europe with trucks, tanks, and planes. One POW recalled staring at rows of freshly built Jeeps parked outside a Midwest plant, more vehicles than his entire division had fielded during the North African campaign. The message was clear. America could outproduce Germany not just in war machines, but in every facet of logistics. What impressed the prisoners further was the role of ordinary citizens. Women worked in machine shops, students welded steel, and farmers drove tractors with mechanical efficiency. Industrial power was not hidden behind party slogans or forced labor camps. It was openly embraced by a society mobilized for war. For soldiers raised to believe that only authoritarian systems could achieve unity, this democratic efficiency was both unsettling and inspiring. In the quiet of their barracks, German soldiers began to understand what the phrase "arsenal of democracy" truly meant. It was not propaganda, it was reality, and that reality made their own defeat feel not only possible, but inevitable. If America's factories left the German POWs stunned, its farms delivered an equally profound shock. Many of the prisoners came from rural regions of Germany, where small plots of land were cultivated by hand or with limited machinery. Horses pulled plows, and harvests depended on long days of manual labor. Wartime had only deepened the hardship, with many young men drafted and fertilizer diverted to the military. German farms struggled to feed the population, and shortages were constant. In America, the scale was unlike anything they had ever seen. Fields stretched to the horizon, worked not by peasants but by massive tractors and combines that seemed almost like machines from the future. One prisoner described in a letter how he watched a single farmer manage land larger than his entire village back home. He could not understand how a family of 4 could accomplish in a day what dozens of German laborers might do in a week. The variety of crops also astonished them. Cornfields spread across states, wheat fields rippled like oceans, and fruit orchards produced abundance beyond imagination. Even during wartime, stores overflowed with canned goods, milk, butter, and meat. POWs assigned to agricultural work sometimes laughed in disbelief when American farmers complained of shortages. What the locals considered short supplies still exceeded anything their families had seen in years. The logistics were equally impressive. Grain moved from silo to railcar in minutes. Meatpacking plants processed livestock with staggering efficiency, and refrigerated trucks carried food across vast distances. The Germans marveled that such abundance was not reserved for elites or officers, but was part of daily life for ordinary people. To men raised in a culture where food scarcity defined existence, this was a revelation. Perhaps the most demoralizing discovery came when they realized that America could feed both its vast civilian population and its military overseas while still having enough left to supply its allies. The Lend-Lease shipments they had cursed in the deserts of North Africa and the fields of Russia suddenly made sense. The United States had food to spare. The impact on morale was immense. If Germany struggled simply to feed its people, while America overflowed with agricultural might, how could the Reich hope to sustain a global war? In those fields of plenty, German prisoners began to grasp that their homeland was fighting an opponent fueled by inexhaustible resources. For German POWs, the war did not end when they laid down their weapons. Their connection to home continued through letters exchanged with families in the Reich. These carefully censored communications became another window into the reality of the conflict, and another blow to their confidence in Nazi ideology. The letters arriving from Germany painted grim pictures. Families described ration lines stretching for hours, meals built from thin soups and black bread, and nights huddled in basements as bombs shook the ground above. Mothers wrote of children wearing patched clothing, of shortages so severe that even soap became a rarity. These words contrasted brutally with the abundance prisoners were experiencing in the United States. The men in captivity often ate more meat in a week than their families did in a month. Cigarettes, a prized currency in Germany, were handed out in American camps as casually as rations of bread. Prisoners sometimes hesitated to tell the truth in their own letters. At first they downplayed their treatment, fearing it would seem disloyal to admit they were living comfortably under enemy guard. But over time, comparisons slipped through. Some wrote about the size of American farms, others mentioned the brightness of cities at night, or the endless trains loaded with supplies. Families receiving these accounts were astonished. Could it really be that the enemy lived with such wealth while Germany endured deprivation? Censorship limited what could be said, yet even restrained descriptions carried weight. A father in Bavaria reading that his son was healthy, well-fed, and earning camp wages could not ignore the contrast to his own struggle to survive each day. These subtle acknowledgments undermined propaganda more effectively than Allied leaflets or broadcasts. The Reich had promised its people that the Anglo-American nations were decadent and weak. The letters revealed otherwise. Inside the camps, the correspondence sparked debates. Die-hard Nazis dismissed family accounts as exaggeration or blamed Germany's suffering on Allied bombers. But for the majority, the gap between words on paper and daily life in America eroded their convictions. Every letter widened the divide between ideology and reality. By 1944, many German prisoners openly admitted among themselves that they were better off behind American fences than their loved ones were in the fatherland. These letters were more than personal exchanges. They were instruments of quiet transformation, chiseling away at the foundation of belief that had once bound them so tightly to the Reich. From their earliest days in the Wehrmacht, German soldiers had been told that they belonged to a nation of unmatched discipline, efficiency, and technological prowess. The Reich boasted of its superior culture and insisted that enemies like the United States were incapable of waging modern war. Yet inside America's POW camps, surrounded by evidence to the contrary, those myths began to crumble. The shock started with industry. Men who had once marched proudly behind panzer divisions now saw factories that dwarfed anything they had known in Germany. The claim that only authoritarian control could produce order collapsed when they realized American democracy had mobilized production lines with even greater efficiency. Assembly plants staffed by ordinary workers, women, immigrants, and even students, were producing weapons faster than German factories driven by forced labor. Technology provided another humbling revelation. German propaganda had glorified the Messerschmitt, the Panzer, and the U-boat as proof of superiority. But here, prisoners watched train after train hauling Sherman tanks, P-51 Mustangs, and endless supplies of jeeps and trucks. What unsettled them most was not just the quality of American equipment, but the sheer quantity. A prisoner wrote that while the Reich celebrated each newly completed tank, America produced so many vehicles that some were parked unused in open fields. The myth of racial superiority also faltered. German POWs expected a racially segregated, chaotic society. Instead, while they observed divisions and tensions, they were unsettled by the fact that African American soldiers guarded them, served in the U.S. Army, and worked in war industries. The sight of black Americans wearing the same uniform as white soldiers, and doing so for a victorious military, challenged one of the Reich's deepest ideological pillars. Even discipline itself turned into a myth exposed. German camps had been ruled by fear, where dissent was crushed by party loyalty. In America, they saw a society functioning with open debate, newspapers criticizing leaders, and citizens questioning policies. Yet instead of collapsing into chaos, the system thrived. Democracy, they realized, was not weakness, but strength. For many prisoners, these experiences tore apart the carefully constructed worldview they had carried from the Reich. The conviction that Germany's destiny was to dominate Europe with cultural and technological superiority no longer held weight. Each day in captivity, every sight of abundance and freedom reinforced the same conclusion. The myths they had been raised to believe were illusions, and America's power was undeniable. By late 1944, the German prisoners held across America were no longer the same men who had been captured in North Africa or Normandy. What had begun as shock and disbelief slowly turned into a profound re-evaluation of everything they had been taught under the Reich. Seeds of transformation were taking root, not through lectures or forced indoctrination, but through the relentless power of observation. Daily life inside the camps played a crucial role. Prisoners were provided with structured routines, meals, work assignments, and opportunities for recreation. Baseball diamonds, libraries, and even art workshops appeared behind the fences. These small glimpses of normality, unexpected in wartime captivity, created a contrast with the brutality of German-run prison camps, where starvation and fear were tools of control. POWs admitted privately that they had been treated with more humanity by their enemies than by their own government. Education became another quiet revolution. The U.S. military initiated programs offering lectures on history, politics, and literature. At first, many Germans scoffed, dismissing the classes as propaganda. Yet curiosity won out. Soon, thousands signed up to study English, mathematics, and democratic philosophy. For many, it was the first time they encountered writers like Thomas Paine, Jefferson, or Lincoln, not as slogans, but as ideas grounded in lived practice. Interactions with civilians deepened this transformation. When POWs were assigned to farms or factories under guard, they discovered that ordinary Americans, housewives, laborers, students, treated them with a surprising degree of decency. Farmers invited them to share meals after long days in the fields. Children waved at them through fences. Such experiences struck the prisoners harder than any lecture could. Here were people who should have hated them, yet instead showed simple kindness. Reports began circulating among camp leaders of ideological collapse. Some men still clung to the Reich's teachings, but more quietly admitted they could never return to old beliefs. They had seen too much. They had witnessed that prosperity could exist without conquest, that strength could grow from liberty, and that dignity could be extended even to enemies. The seeds planted in those years would not fully bloom until after the war, but their roots were firm. A subtle shift had occurred. Men once sworn to defend a dictatorship at all costs were slowly preparing to embrace democracy. The greatest weapon America wielded was not a bomber or a tank. It was the undeniable demonstration of what a free society could achieve. When the war finally ended in 1945, German POWs across America awaited their fate. Many expected humiliation, forced labor, or endless imprisonment. Instead, the process of repatriation revealed just how much their time in the United States had transformed them. Between 1945 and 1946, the majority of the 371,683 prisoners were gradually sent back to Europe. Yet they did not return as the same men who had marched into battle under the swastika. They carried with them memories of abundance, fairness, and democracy. Lessons learned not in classrooms, but in the fields, factories, and small towns of America. Upon returning home, many were confronted with a Germany reduced to rubble. Cities lay in ruins, food was scarce, and political chaos loomed. For countless former POWs, their experience in the United States provided a framework for what Germany could become. They spoke of factories that ran like clockwork, of farms so vast they dwarfed anything in Europe, and of ordinary people living with freedoms and comforts unimaginable under dictatorship. These first-hand accounts became seeds of democratic thought in a shattered land. The American re-education effort showed its true results in the post-war decades. Some former prisoners took on vital roles in rebuilding Germany. Walter Hallstein, once a soldier captured in 1944, later became one of the architects of the European Economic Community, a forerunner to the European Union. Countless others carried smaller but equally important lessons into local government, schools, and businesses. They embodied a quiet yet profound shift from authoritarian loyalty to democratic conviction. Statistics reveal just how effective this transformation was. Out of hundreds of thousands held, fewer than 0.6% attempted escape, an astonishingly low figure compared to other conflicts. The rest stayed, worked, and learned, many admitting later that life in the American camps had opened their eyes to realities hidden from them in Germany. The so-called enemy had become a teacher, and America's industrial might was more than just steel and machines. It was the visible proof of a system that worked. In the end, the story of German POWs in the United States is not only about captivity, but about redemption. America's greatest triumph wasn't simply in the battles it won abroad, but in the minds it reshaped at home. Behind the barbed wire, a generation of former enemies discovered that democracy, abundance, and human dignity could be stronger than any weapon of war. And in that realization, the path toward a future alliance between Germany and the United States was quietly forged.